For today's critical thought, I want to talk a little bit about indie development. This past week was the big E3 show, which kind of dominated the news, and we didn't do a Safely Extreme cast. But as we've seen in the last 3 years, kind of the prestige of indie development has grown, with many notable and even some first time indie studios appearing on E3. So for today, I want to talk a little bit about what it means to survive and compete in the space when indie developers are being propped up to sit alongside AAA, and why you have to be very aware of going too big. Each year, when it comes to the independent space, we are seeing developers more and more kind of raise the bar of what it means to make an indie game these days. I made a post a few weeks ago that I'll include a link somewhere up there, where I talked about how much things have changed over the last decade, where the idea of indie went from being just some shovelware game that you play for, $1.99 when you're bored, two major artistic expressions, Game of the Year award winning examples, and titles that you just can't see anywhere else. And by the time this video goes up, E3 should either be close to wrapping up or wrapping up, and you can see just how much representation there is in the independent space among major companies, the PC Game Show, and even again with companies like Microsoft buying as many indie studios as they can. But while this is certainly a great time for independent developers, it's important to understand what your options are when it comes to releasing a game as an indie dev versus a AAA. Because I'm sure somebody out there is saying to themselves, hey, with public engines these days and, people being more aware about independent developers, I'm sure me and my three friends can make the cel-shaded Skyrim game we've all been dreaming about for $50,000 and only takes 7 months to make. Right now, there's a developer who's just started crying for some unexplainable reason, and I apologize for that. But one of the surefire ways to kind of handicap or cut yourself off at the kneecap when it comes to being an indie dev is going too big with your projects. And it's important to understand where the indie advantages lie versus AAA. And this actually goes with my other piece about the science of game design that I'm actually going to be preparing a separate video on. But when it comes to some of the very best examples of indie games released in the last 4 or 5 years, there are several things that are consistent between them. The first is focusing on something that you don't see from AAA developers, whether it's just a very impressive Metroidvania like Ori up there, Hollow Knight, the kind of emotionally driven story of Celeste, the just out there choose your own adventure style of Disco Elysium. And again, we can just rattle off all the indie games that I play on a week by week basis. Well, the one thing that you can't say about them is that they are hitting the same notes as AAA. And this is very important to consider. No matter how powerful public engines like Unity, Unreal, GameMaker, and any other ones you can think of have gotten, it still doesn't make up for something very important: time and budget. When we look at AAA studios, they have a lot of cards in their hands in terms of advantages. And as an indie dev, you can't just immediately go and say to themselves, let me just make a game that's just like a AAA. Or what we see from a lot of developers who come from a AAA or AA studio, that they'll try to make a game similar to what they just worked on. Whether it was someone like a Yuji Naka trying to do Battleland Wonderworld, or I'm sure there are other examples. That's the biggest one that comes to my mind. And the problem is that as an independent developer, you can't compete toe-to-toe when it comes to the AAA space, no matter, again, what engine you're working on. One, because you don't have the budget and the manpower that AAA studio provides, and two, it's important to understand just how much fandom and clout really mean in all aspects of the game development industry or game industry itself. When we look at studios that have made it, people like Clay Entertainment, Red Hook Games, Kit Fox Games, the developers Amplitude of Dungeon of the Endless fame, that once you are big enough to establish your own clout and fan base, it really does afford you that ability to experiment and also lets you get away with things that a smaller or first-time indie dev can't. One of the reasons why I say you don't want to compete directly with AAA is that AAA developers make mistakes. We can certainly criticize Blizzard, BioWare, Nintendo, Valve, Activision, EA. Oh, we can certainly criticize EA. But the criticisms that you can levy against these studios are often just mitigated or downplayed by their sheer fandom. Doesn't matter how many people who have phones or not, I'm sure there are going to be a lot of fans of Blizzard who are going to be buying Overwatch 2 and Diablo 4 and whatever else they're working on at the moment. But as an independent studio, you don't have that shield. So any problems or any things that would have been, swept aside or ignored, people are going to complain the hell about at your studio. And unless you can somehow wrangle up, Blizzard amount of money or Nintendo's fandom, you're going to have to work almost 3 to 5 times as hard on your game than a AAA studio would, especially when it comes to marketing. As you know, we do our Thursday shows with Shark and the Inquiries, and a AAA or a famous studio, they can get away with a very bare-bones store page, and their game will probably still get 5 to 10,000 reviews and probably sell several times more than that. As a no-name developer, you don't have that advantage, and that's kind of the MO for today's video. That you can't just chase major companies, both in terms of the games they are making, as well as the quality of their titles as an independent studio. You need to do something different. And the advantages of being an indie dev is that you do have that luxury. When I speak to developers like Tomo, Ramin, and again the slew of indie devs we've interviewed and we're always looking for more, indie devs can pivot at a rate that AAA and even AA studios just can't. And that pivot can mean either changing their game if something's not right, or experimenting with ideas and seeing which one works. You're not going to see a studio like Nintendo just, throw out random ideas and see what sticks. Now, technically as any dev, you shouldn't be just releasing every game idea you have. But if you want to experiment with something that is not going to be a 5 to 10 million, worldwide bestseller, you can find these niches that have gone pretty much unnoticed and not catered for a long time. This is where Stardew Valley has excelled so well with, because there weren't any Harvest Moon games on the PC, so the developer just said, I'm going to make my own. And now we're seeing people trying to copycat Stardew, which was copycatting Harvest Moon originally. But having this very wide canvas in terms of game concepts and ideas is very important as an indie developer. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about what happens when a developer goes too fast and too big at the same time, and how this can often lead to games almost like dovetailing right out of the gates. But before we get to that, if you're interested in more of my thoughts on design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books. For entry-level students, we have 20 essential games to study, and then the Game Design Deep Dive series that takes an extensive look at different genres, with horror coming by the end of 2021. When it comes to competing in the independent space, again, the rise and growing use of public engines has been pivotal in terms of the bar being raised among indie developers. But you have to again understand that just because the tools are there, and even if you have the knowledge from your previous job or your previous experience, it's important to understand just what you are capable of doing as an independent developer versus at a major company. And of course, the footage that you're seeing right now is from Biomutant. This is a game that we spent an hour on stream before I just threw my hands up and said enough. And the thing about Biomutant is that it was developed by former Avalanche Studio devs, which is of course the makers of Just Cause, one of the best, or Just Cause 2 being one of the best open world style games I've played, and of course Mad Max. So you would think that with that pedigree, that Biomutant would have been right out of the gates this amazing experience. And instead, I saw almost every major red flag in terms of UI, UX, and gameplay within 20 to 30 minutes of playing this game. And this is something that I talked about in my Science of Game Design article, that understanding the fundamentals of what it means to work in a genre and what people expect out of that core gameplay loop is not something that is immediately understood, no matter what your background is in game development. I've played some amazing games that come from first-time developers, sometimes even students who are just taking like a passion project and trying to make it work. And those games can sometimes be better mechanically speaking than titles at AAA companies and even from former AAA developers. Again, you've seen when I talked about Vision Soft Reset, that while it wasn't the best game and while it did have some flaws to it, it was still an amazing title. And that is more than I can say when I see developers who are trying to chase the AAA dragon, I guess. Another big example would be every developer who's trying to make the next Witcher or the next Skyrim. I mean, how many open world RPGs have come out following the rise of the Witcher series? And how many of them have done anywhere near as well as that? And you have to understand as a developer that if you're going to try and compete, and when we say compete, I mean having your game be priced very high, people are expecting more out of that. And again, they don't care about your studio name. They don't care your credits. They care what's on the store page. And with something like Balan Wonderworld and Biomutant, that these games had structural issues in terms of their gameplay experience. Stuff that as an indie developer, you cannot do. And let me repeat that. If you are working in the independent space, you cannot have problems with your game. This is what we talked about in the last section when it comes to marketing. As a developer, as an unknown indie dev, your games really have to be almost like 2 to 3 times higher quality in terms of polish and uniqueness to compete with the graphical sheen and the sheer amount of money thrown thrown from AAA studios. We've seen developers like with Souls Lakes, for instance, as another big example of people trying to copy the From Software formula. And if they try to just directly compete with From Software, oftentimes these games just end up being worse examples. Again, this is what you want to avoid. You don't want people describing your game as it's just like X, but worse. And that may seem very straightforward, but we've seen developers fail to learn this lesson. If you want to be inspired by Dark Souls, or you want to be inspired by Stardew Valley, or Stalker, or Mario, or whatever, you have to run with that in a different direction. A direction that those studios wouldn't have gone with. As an example, with Mortal Shell. Mortal Shell is a Souls-like. It is very similar in terms of that function as a Dark Souls or Bloodborne game. But instead of trying to directly compete with From Software, they designed the game to be far more streamlined, to have a different flow of combat with the hardened system, and they put it on the short side. They didn't want to make an 8 to 12 or 8 to 20 hour long game. And Mortal Shell did surprisingly well because of that. And again, this was the first major game from the studio. I don't know what the pedigree and the background were of the developers, but it did what it had to do, and most importantly, it stuck the landing. And that's what you need to comprehend as an indie developer. That at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you were the lead at a major studio. You don't have that backing and that support anymore. And it's better to use your knowledge to make something different and unique than to just try and chase what you've done before. And like I've said in my piece, that Red Hook Games is a really big example of this. Chris Barassa and Tyler Sigmund had many years of experience in the AAA space and at major companies before they formed Red Hook. And they could have easily just said to themselves, let's just do one of the games we know and try and repeat our success. But instead, with Darkest Dungeon, they did something different and unique. And it worked amazingly well for them. And like I said in the past, it's very easy for a lot of developers, a lot of students, not to understand the amount of work and the amount of research and just sheer grit that goes into these games succeeding. And from the outside, you're never going to comprehend that unless, you get a chance to talk to those developers personally. And returning to Biomutant again, when we look at games like Biomutant and Balan Wonderworld, these games just have so many faults with their design, and there's nothing kind of shielding it from that criticism. Again, the consumers know the name Sonic, but they don't exactly know the name Yuji Naka, and they don't care if you worked on Sonic games if the game you're playing right now is not that good. And interestingly, both Biomutant and Balan Wonderworld were both priced at $60, I believe, on day one. And again, there is a greater discussion to be had about pricing video games and kind of retaking the value of pricing that's going on in the independent space today, but that's beyond our video for today. So to wrap things up, the independent space has grown by leaps and bounds. And you are given a huge amount of space to create whatever kind of game you want in today's market. But it's important to remember that no matter how powerful Unity is, no matter how much you can get out of Unreal, it does not replace good game design. And if you're trying to compete directly with AAA developers, most likely you are going to fail. You want to focus on games that are within your scope and budget to work on, that you can really do something different with. Whether it is a narrative-driven game like Gone Home, something that is mechanically interesting like Oxygen Not Included, or something like Disco Elysium that nobody saw at that level of polish and theme. And if you can do that right, you can succeed. And maybe developers like Clay, like the Disco Elysium devs, and some of the bigger names in the independent space could work on games that could have that $49 or $59 price tag at some point. But remember, the more price you expect, or the more of a price tag you put on your game, the more people expect out of it. And if you think that people are going to be accepting of a 2 to 5 hour short form narrative driven game at $60, Yeah, I don't think that's going to be happening, at least not for a while. So as always, thank you so much for watching this video. Be sure to check out the Discord and Patreon link down below. If you're interested in seeing more detailed videos and examinations on the channel, be sure to check out the Patreon, as that is our current goal. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Until next time, take care.